Good afternoon, boys and girls. Today in reading class, we're going to talk a little bit about poetry. Go ahead and get out your reading notebook. In the table of contents, in the fiction section, please label your table of contents fiction. Not fiction, excuse me, poetry. And go ahead and give it a page number. When you're done with that, let your teacher know that you are ready to move on by being quiet and raising your hand or whatever signal your teacher has. All right, so now we're going to go on to poetry. I wanted to start with giving you an example of what poetry is, or at least get your brain thinking about that. Here's an example of poetry from the Shel Silverstein series. A lot of you are very familiar with him. An appointment with the dentist, who said, "Now open wide." And once he prized my jaws apart, he deftly jumped inside. He mountaineered over molars and trampolined on my tongue, then quickly jumped back out again and said, "That's it, you're done." What you'll notice about poetry is that a lot of times poetry is written with very specific. Let me get to the right page here, I'm jumping around. Poetry is written with short lines put together, which we call verses, and the verses are grouped in what we call stanza. And let me give you an example of that. If on the sheet that your teacher gave you, you've got a poem called "The Road Not Taken," you'll see that in poetry you have lines, and that's what I've got underlined here in the orange line. And then the lines are grouped together called stanzas. And poetry is written in a variety of stanzas. Each stanza may have rhyming words together. The stanzas may be grouped for a specific emotion, things like that. So when we're looking at our notes and things like that, I think here I've got them typed up a little bit better here. We'll write these into our notes here in a little bit. Poetry uses figurative language and literary devices to evoke emotion in the reader. A lot of times when you're writing a poem, you want to have that reader get some kind of emotion out of it, whether it's joy or sadness or fear. A lot of times poetry is trying to get that emotion from you. As I was saying earlier, poetry is written in lines and verses, and the lines are grouped into stanzas. It's different than the prose we talked about yesterday, where we had paragraphs and things like that. Here they're grouped into stanzas. Okay? So it's a new vocabulary that you're going to use when you're talking about vocabulary. A verse is a line of poetry. Okay, verses may or may not be complete sentences. If we go back to that one that I talked about earlier, it's not necessarily a complete sentence. He trampolined on my tongue, and it doesn't have he there, he just trampolined on my tongue. If you wrote that in a prose, you would get marked wrong because it's not a complete sentence. In poetry, it doesn't have to be. Poems are broken into groups of lines called stanzas. Poems have stanzas instead of paragraphs. So as I was saying earlier, here, this section, this is one stanza, okay? And then here is another stanza. Going back to our notes, if we look at what your teacher has for you, you're going to get a poem. This poem's called "The Road Not Taken" by a very well-known author called Robert Frost. What I want you to do is go ahead and identify the stanzas and leave it so you can still read the poem. So just maybe on the side in a certain color, go ahead and label stanza for each one of these. And then each line, underline just one of them and label it a line. What I'd also like you to do is identify the rhyming words with one color. Go ahead and box out the words that rhyme. So if I look at this first stanza, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And beyond traveler long I stood, and looked down as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So the words that rhyme there would be would and stood and could. So those all should be one color boxed in. And then another one, um, traveled both and growth. Those two words rhyme. So you'll do those in another color. And it may be helpful to go ahead and label that those are the rhyming words. Go ahead and then do that for the other stanza also. And again, then what we're going to do is what I talked about earlier, is in your iPod here, poetry reminders for you that poetry uses figurative language and literary devices, and basically we want to evoke emotion again. Poetry is written in lines and stanzas. A verse is a line in poetry. Poetry may or may not be complete sentences, and poems are broken into groups called stanzas. Okay, they don't use paragraphs like we did in the prose earlier. Go ahead and put this into your reading notebook, and be prepared later on. I'm going to give you some examples of different types of writing, and you're going to be asked to identify it as prose or poetry, or tomorrow we will do another example of a different type of writing. So good luck. If you have any questions, go back to the slides and see if you can find what you needed there.